Chapter 2. The American Indians and the Medicine Man. Priest, Prophet, and Healer. Miracles under the watchful eye. The methods of healing specialists, suffering as punishment, religious beliefs, and the good spirit masters of hypnosis. The Indian hope of the Sitting Bull and the miracles. The holy men of medicine, healing with sand, painting intellectual birth by flying seeds, the conclusions of the misinformed and uninformed, guidance through prayer. Priest, prophet, and healer. The dictionary makes no distinction in meaning between the terms healer and medicine man, but assigns the former to one who practices voodoo African and the second to the mystery priests of the American Indian tribes. In reality, the two represent different stages in the development of occult practices. The healer came first, and only through a long and complicated evolutionary process did he develop into the medicine man. It is an unfortunate choice of words to describe the Indian mystic as a medicine man. Semantically speaking, it causes, through association of ideas, a completely erroneous conception of the structure of indigenous metaphysics, with the term now so firmly established in the language that it is impossible to change it. It is necessary to clarify, as far as possible, the natural confusion that results from using a familiar word in a completely unfamiliar sense. We think of medicine as a medicinal substance used in the treatment of diseases, and so a medicine man would be someone who gives medicines, a doctor. In this sense, however, it conveys no proper conception of the Native American saint. The term was bestowed some 200 years ago by ignorant white people, with the intention of discrediting him, and subsequently, the medicine man fell even further into disrepute when the term was adopted by itinerant charlatans, unscrupulous white men who sold various fail-safe elixirs and cures for snake bites, supposedly authentic Native American remedies, but in reality they were completely useless concoctions. The dictionary recognizes that the medicine it is a synonym for magic, as applied to magical forms of healing. This meaning, while far from accurate, is still misleading. The medicine man is not necessarily a healer, although healing may be one of his tasks. Indians have long used the word medicine to any mysterious force beyond their understanding. When the U.S. military began using burst rifles against the Indians, these rapid-fire weapons were described by the tribes as powerful medicine, because the Sioux did not understand how the rifles could be loaded so quickly. For Native Americans, the medicine man was someone who possessed supernatural powers as a prophet, seer, miracle worker, priest, physician, spiritist, or spiritual healer. He might be just one of these, or he might combine several of these roles. Primarily, the medicine man was a holy man who could communicate with spirits and knew the ways of the gods. He was often also the tribal historian. Most of these priests possessed extraordinary memories, miracles under the watchful eye. Modern skeptics inclined to dismiss the supernatural powers of the medicine man would do well to remember the conditions under which he worked. This prophet-priest lived and performed his miracles under the watchful eyes of his fellow tribesmen. They knew his life from the beginning. They had seen the mystical look in his eyes. They knew he would choose the path of the seer. They remembered his first visions, and many times they had seen him return from his long vigils with the sacred fire. It would be difficult for a man to be an impostor from his childhood, especially when other watchful and sometimes zealous medicine men were always present to test the spirits. His miraculous work was constantly requested for various services, and if he failed in his incantations, he did not retain popular respect for long, nor could he move to another community if his failures became known. For the medicine man to maintain his good reputation throughout a long and eventful life, his experiments had to be successful in considerable numbers. The more advanced indigenous nations were too intelligent to be easily deceived, and it was among them that the mysterious priest attained his greatest power and developed his supernatural arts to their fullest extent. If the tribe needed rain, it was the medicine man's duty to find some way of producing it. Excuses might work for a while, but nevertheless, it had to rain, or there would certainly be a new medicine man. If an important member of the tribe was struck by illness, it was hoped that the medicine man would discover and administer the necessary remedies. Too many failures in this process would also be disastrous, and this healer could not hide behind the declaration that a disease was incurable, as a modern doctor can and often does. Nothing is impossible for one who possesses supernatural powers. The desired cure is the only truly satisfying outcome of a medical consultation. If the hunt was poor, the medicine man was consulted about the exact location of where to hunt, and after he made his declaration, the hunters set off. It is difficult to know what might have happened to the shaman if the animals had not been there, and the hunters had to return empty-handed, for the simple reason that there was always good hunting in the places indicated by the priest. Several times the tribe might expect trouble from another band of Indians, or from threatening white men. Then there would be a council, with the medicine man required, upon request, to describe the enemy's condition, indicating their whereabouts and strength. Often, the survival of the entire tribe depended on the accuracy of the priest's mystical vision. It had to be correct in every detail, even if the enemy might be hundreds of miles away. These were the daily tasks of the revered seer, and the entire tribe judged the results. How many of our most highly trained scientists could qualify for the position of medicine man in a Plains Indian tribe? Only results mattered, excuses were buried with the dead, the methods of specialists in the healing. The most advanced medicine man specialized in healing. In addition to his magical powers, he possessed knowledge of medicine and surgery. His physiotherapy included massage, sweat baths, sunbathing, counter-irritants, and local pressure on the hands and feet. He also set broken bones, performed bloodletting, tooth extractions, and bandaged wounds. Diet and fasting were practiced by most primitive peoples, and the medicine man prescribed them when necessary. Herbs have been used since ancient times, and experienced experts combined medicinal herbs, sometimes using animal and mineral substances. Medicine, as a science, was highly developed among the indigenous peoples of Yucatan and other parts of Central America, 2,000 years before Columbus's arrival. These peoples possessed dentures and prostheses, perfected various surgical instruments, and performed cesarean sections long before the birth of Julius Caesar. Many important changes had to take place in the structure of ancient society before the dominance of the healer was left behind and the medicine man became the guardian of his people. The most significant of these changes came gradually in the realm of religion. The concept of God emerged to bring order to the world of primitive man's spirits. The processes that produced this can be studied among peoples like the Egyptians. They had a large and complex pantheon of deities. The guardian spirits of powerful tribes gained prestige as their temporal power increased. Conquered peoples accepted the spirits in which their conquerors believed, and these victorious spirits gradually assumed the proportions of gods. There were gods of peace and war, gods of cities and towns, gods of earth, air, and fire, gods of the living and the dead. As provinces increased in power, their gods acquired national influence, and eventually the most successful deities became the supreme gods, while the less fortunate remained as tutelary deities. With the belief in God came the transfer of indigenous virtues to this invisible being, the strong and loving protector of his children. In this way, God became good because the ways of the tribe itself were always good. Humankind made its God in its own image, or the image of what humankind desired to be. The tribal god was a great chief, a glorified extension of the physical chief. This chief spirit was the master of all lesser spirits and ghosts, and they had to obey him. This belief, that malevolent entities were no longer free to roam and afflict others at will, brought order to the world. Now, if any evil being wished to do harm, the good Lord would come to the aid of his people and punish the guilty spirit. Evil spirits, of course, resisted this loss of power and tried in many ways. They tried to outwit God, but this was not possible, because God, who knew all things, could thwart the purposes of the evil spirits. It was the good God against the evil spirits, and the struggle resulted in anthropomorphism, the doctrine of God and the devil fighting for control of the world. Soon, the good men in this world tried to help God and lived according to his will, and after death, their spirits could still help him and protect the tribe. The wicked men, who disobeyed God, continued to torment the living after they died, and so it became necessary for God to punish them. Therefore, good and evil came into being, white magic and black magic were divided, and the sorcerer acquired a bad reputation. Suffering as punishment. Then came a culmination of psychological realization that altered the entire course of human endeavor. This was the belief that suffering was a punishment for disobeying God. This made it necessary for all those afflicted by pain or illness to atone for their sins as an offering to God. This belief didn't work so well, because the virtuous and the vicious suffered many of the same misfortunes, but the belief had been empirically established, so the facts had to be altered to fit preconceived ideas. When there was no fault in the unfortunate patient to explain their ailment, a suitable vice was fabricated. Such beliefs as that the sins of the parents are inherited by the children, and with the fall of Adam, we are all sinners, are examples of efforts to explain the misfortunes of the virtuous person. It was also suspected that evil spirits or ghosts might try to lead men astray from God through various temptations. This became a popular concept, one that was further complicated by the implication that God himself might tempt his children to test the sincerity of their devotion. Saints battling Satan and Job covered in sores are illustrations of these views. From primitive man's struggle to reconcile the realities of life with the framework of his beliefs arose some of the world's most unpleasant and unconvincing religious doctrines. We must consider the spiritual dilemmas of semi-civilized humanity. Man obeyed God and suffered. He disobeyed God and suffered. He made offerings to God and still suffered. Or he sold his soul to evil spirits and still suffered. Regardless, he suffered, became ill, and died. One has to wonder, in the end, did man decide that God wanted him to be miserable, and was there anything wrong with being happy or comfortable? In this situation, there was no rest for the mind, and the ancients were miserably pressured, searching for some bearable code of life. The time had come to inquire, and the condition of the soul after death began to intrigue their minds. Still in Homer's time, in the 1st century 9 before Christ, the Greeks believed that the dead dwelt forever in a grey land of shadows, so the poorest mortals were more fortunate than the most illustrious dead. But it seemed obvious that God had to live somewhere, and since he was invisible, his house also had to be invisible. And so the invisible hut of the good God marked the beginning of our conception of the afterlife. These were days when greatness was measured by strength, skill, and physical possessions. God resided in the finest hut, had the best livestock, and the most desirable slaves. Wasn't God the mighty chieftain above all chieftains? Thus, heaven came into being. The Valhalla of the strong was always adorned with the best, in terms of the things most desirable to men. For example, when gold was introduced as a symbol of wealth, heaven was immediately paved with it. Heaven became the great escape for poor mortals who suffer without peace in this world. But that puts us at the forefront of our story, because the medicine man came before theology had settled with its doctrine of earthly misery and heavenly happiness. He belonged to that pagan order of things that celebrates a belief in joy and in living life to the full. he was no one to moralize so deeply about the origin of disease. He believed in the good God, and with his simple way of life, he came much closer to a natural religion than those deeply involved in theological complications. He was never influenced by the notion that humanity was so wicked as to be in constant need of salvation, and he was so respectful of the various religious beliefs of his neighbors that he could not be agitated by questions such as which of the different creeds was the most inspired. What he did know was that his faith was the right one for him, and he assumed that others had the same sense of security, religious beliefs and good spirit. It is not possible here to fully discuss the diverse indigenous beliefs, as these were distributed among the many tribes and nations. But it can be said that most Native Americans believed in one God, or Great Spirit, who communicated with his children through the visions and dreams of priests, and sometimes through those of lay people. After death the soul could go to some happy land, or, according to Chief Seattle's words, when the last red man has perished from the earth, and his memory among white men has become myth, these shores will be filled with the invisible dead of my tribe. Some Native Americans believed that the spirits of the dead remained among the living to serve and protect them in times of need. The medicine man considered all spirits evil, but he regarded most as good. The medicine man shared many of the practices and beliefs of the medicine man, but always with refinements and a marked improvement in his mental perspective. The mask, the rattle, and the drum remained, but all these instruments were now part of an integrated religious worldview. In some parts of the country, the medicine man still had to contend with sorcerers and witches, but these adherents of black magic had lost their status and were ostracized by the respectable community. Rites were transformed into rituals, and magical ceremonies were explained in terms of religious symbolism. Every song and dance took on a definite meaning, a gateway to the light of tribal tradition. The spiritual leader was now entering into his leadership. As a priest, he became a servant of his God, doing the will of the Great Spirit as it was revealed to him through an inner communion. The medicine man still sought his God in the ancient magical way, through dreams, visions, and trances. Most of the great leaders of the indigenous nations, from Hiawatha to Geronimo, drew their strength from visions, which occasionally came to people who were not priests. The celebrated warrior Crazy Horse had a spiritual experience in his youth, and it is known that because of this he believed he could never be killed in battle, and he was right. His death was due to treachery, under a flag of truce. During Custer's wars, when a medicine man rode by, American soldiers would fire several volleys at him from a distance of less than 100 feet, but neither the Indian nor his horse were touched. When the medicine man returned to his warriors, he would shake the bullets off his war shirt. Some tribes, like the Ojibwa, required long periods of specialized training for those who would become medicine priests, but it was more common for young men to choose the profession themselves and then rise to fame and authority through their own abilities. In some cases, spiritual gifts were considered hereditary or prenatal. Men were also called by visions in old age, but usually the visions began in childhood, and by the time a young man was 12 or 13 years old, it was common knowledge within the tribe that he was to become a priest. Sometimes he studied with the elder medicine men, but this was not necessary, as the visions taught him everything he needed to know. The best book that has caught my attention on the subject of the mystical experiences of the medicine man is Black Elk, Speaks the Story of the Life of a Holy Man of Oglala Sioux. The work is autobiographical and was dictated to John G. Neihart through an interpreter. Black Elk's great vision came to him when he was 9 years old. The experience lasted 12 days, and during all that time his body lay in a deep, lifeless coma. Upon his return from the spirit world, he remembered seeing his own body lying in the teepee, and as he approached to enter his body again, someone said, "The boy is coming back. It would be best to give him some water." Years later, Black Elk was part of a group of Native Americans taken to Europe on a theatrical adventure. While on the other side of the Great Water, this priest made a spiritual journey to visit his parents on their reservation. This mysterious journey took 3 days, and during that time his body was in a deep trance, and his breathing was barely detectable. These accounts may sound outlandish, but the Native American is a truthful man, especially regarding his religion. The mystical experiences described by the medicine men, when they speak of them, which is not often due to the derision with which such theories are received by most white people, are identical to those recorded in other nations that have developed occult traditions. Indian mystics can see the auras of people's bodies, can enter and leave their own bodies at will, can travel long distances in spirit form, can converse with the dead and help them find their way in the afterlife, can meet the parents and grandparents of the tribe who lived long ago, can see the future in the clouds, can describe words as flames of light emanating from people's mouths, can feel possessed by spirits and intelligences, and can understand the language of animals and birds. At this point, it's important to know that most medicine men speak no language other than their tribe's dialect. It's unlikely they've studied the metaphysical systems of India, China, or Egypt. It's all the more interesting, therefore, that they describe their hidden powers in precisely the same way as these distant cultures. If genuine occult phenomena exist anywhere in the world, they are present among the medicine men of the Native Americans. Masters of hypnosis. These priest diviners are also masters of hypnosis and suggestion. Modern scientists have recognized their excellence, and all indications are that their knowledge of the suggestive arts is far ahead of that of white men. In Medicine and Humanity, Eugene H. Poole, M.D., president of the New York Academy of Medicine, describes a medicine chant he witnessed, which was sung to a young woman suffering from an advanced case of tuberculosis. At the end of the chant, he writes, "I told the medicine man that I thought he was going to work much harder for. His payment was for what I used to do for work. With a friendly smile and a pat on the back, he replied that it also made his patient feel much better. Perhaps he was right. In the same book, Dr. Poole also pays tribute to indigenous knowledge of suggestive therapy, saying, "They have used hypnosis and suggestive treatment much more effectively than we have, and quackery is not as prevalent among them as it is among us now. They have combined religion and medical practice, both highly respected by them and both respectable." The modern physician, of course, has far greater knowledge of anatomy, physiology, and chemistry than the Indians, but the red man surpasses him in all the metaphysical aspects of the healing arts. Moreover, the medicine men, in most cases, have obtained their healing formulas from their visions, which may be significant when considering the cures achieved. From any perspective, the subject is strange and fascinating, and one day, it will be of great importance to the non-Indian physician in his search for medical truths. Luckily for me, a few years ago, I was able to witness a fire-eating ceremony performed by the Native Americans of California. It wasn't a theatrical performance in the strict sense. It was done by the tribe solely for religious purposes. A large pile of hot coals was prepared, and an important medicine man came from the desert to preside. After prayers and chants that lasted well into the night, the priest led his followers to the coals, and kicking the coals with his foot, took a coal in his hands and placed it in his mouth. The others followed suit, and soon a dozen or more were dancing around with the glow of the coals in their mouths, visible across their cheeks in the darkness. The excitement spread to the Native Americans who had gathered to watch the ritual, and within minutes men, women, and children were holding burning coals in their mouths. When the coals stopped glowing, they spat them out and grabbed new ones. Among the participating fire-eaters were 2 men with badges showing they were from the reservation police, but the ceremony was held in secret due to violent opposition from church missionaries. This ceremony belongs to the same category as the famous fire-walking rituals of the Fiji Islands. In the Fijian ritual, a long trench is dug and a fire is kept burning there for several days to create a bed of embers about 6 feet wide and 20 to 30 feet long. The heat is so intense that it is impossible to approach the sides of the trench closer than 10 feet. The firewalkers, after special preparation and sanctification, go to the fire pit and slowly walk the entire length. An occasional firewalker carries a piece of raw meat. When the firewalking journey is over, the meat burns into the ashes. Neither the person nor their clothing is burned in any way. Upon examining the bare feet of the firewalkers, they show not the slightest sign of burns or blisters, even though the heat in the pit can exceed 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. If the power of the mind can prevent a man from being affected by such intense heat, it is time to consider this phenomenon in a far more useful way than simply as a study of personality complexes. Dismissing such miracles by claiming they are the result of mass hypnosis, and that the public merely believes someone is walking on fire, is a ludicrous evasion of the observable and verifiable facts of the events. Nor can these native rituals be compared to modern theatrical performances whose wonders are achieved with the aid of chemical knowledge and advanced devices. A remarkable medicine man on the Blackfoot Indian Reservation in Gleichen, Alberta, described by Chief Buffalo Boy Longspear, this mystic's name was Wolfhead. In 1928 he was still alive at the age of 83. Chief Longspear writes, "Wolfhead has a unique power that is inexplicable even to a highly educated white man, and is recognized by the present Blackfoot Indian agent George H. Gooderham, a graduate of the University of Toronto, a white man who was born among the Indians and has no strange notions about what they can or cannot do. Wolfhead gained his medicine powers when he was struck by lightning at the age of 17, and these mystical abilities remained with him until his conversion to Christianity. Then the visions ceased entirely. His most remarkable feat involves Archdeacon Timms, a missionary who devised a method for writing the Blackfoot language. Wolfhead's spirit guide was called Thunderboy, and one night this spirit appeared and taught the medicine man to write Archdeacon characters. The next morning, the Indian priest astonished the entire tribe, and especially the Archdeacon, who had tried in vain to teach his system, by writing the new symbols perfectly without having received any instruction. Common learning. The Indian hope of the Messiah. By 1888, a mystical messianic doctrine, based largely on visions and metaphysical experiences, spread rapidly among the Plains Indians from Missouri to the Rocky Mountains. The prophet of this new dispensation was Wovoka, a young Paiute man whose vision arose while he lay gravely ill with a fever. An eclipse occurred, and during it, Wovoka came into contact with a strange power. He believed he had been taken to the spirit world, where he received a revelation directly from the God of the Indian peoples. Songs and dances being an important part of the new faith, the sect is often referred to as the ghost dance cult. According to Stanley Vestal, in Sitting Bull the spirit dance sect was completely Christian, except for the difference in the rituals. During the Great Spirit Dance, held in September 1890, an Arapaho miracle worker named Sitting Bull, not the famous Sioux medicine man, performed hypnosis with the aid of an eagle feather. The miracle worker slowly waved this feather before the eyes of the assembled people, speaking strange words in a slow, deliberate tone. Within moments, he achieved hypnosis. Their eyes glazed over, their bodies stiffened, and they fell to the ground in a comatose or complete trance. They remained in this condition for some time. Sitting Bull warned against disturbing those in a trance. They were seeing visions and conversing with the spirits. From the details of this account, it is clear that this important leader of the spirit cult was using methods to induce trances that are essentially no different from those used by psychologists 50 years later. Although the ghost dance's aims were entirely peaceful, and the sect was dedicated to non-resistance and brotherly love, the United States government was determined to prevent the movement's spread. The government's attitude culminated in the Wounded Knee Massacre, when 370 Native Americans who had just surrendered their weapons were murdered in cold blood with Hotchkiss rifles. Among the dead were 250 women and children. Thus ended the Native Americans' hope for a Messiah who would correct the sins of the red man and bring peace to the nations. Sitting Bull and the Miracles. Among the most celebrated of the medicine priests of the American Indians was another Sitting Bull. He was the medicine chief of the Hunkpapa Sioux. Father Bede, who spent most of his life among the Sioux, spoke their language, and knew most of their leaders, eventually converted to their religion and was initiated in their sacred medicine. Lodge. He is an authority on the matter and can state that Sitting Bull was baptized into the Catholic faith. If this is true, he was probably baptized in 1868 by Father Pierre-Jean de Smet. Stanley Vestal doubts the baptism, but mentions in his book Sitting Bull that Father de Smet gave Sitting Bull a brass and wood crucifix, which remains a family treasure. It can be seen on his chest in a well-known photograph of the chief by D.F. Barry, in which he wears a white suede shirt and a single feather in his hair. At this point, Father later lawyer Bede adds, "I know from a reliable source that Sitting Bull frequently prayed to Jesus and spoke of Mary as a human incarnation of the mystical mother, whom the Dakota were taught to worship." Reverend Bede's assessment of Sitting Bull's metaphysical powers is an enjoyable record of his personal struggle with his own mind to reconcile miraculous events with the fixation he had acquired over years of devotion to the Catholic faith. Sitting Bull custard ice. I believe that Sitting Bull possessed unusual powers of pagan oracle divination. My sense of truth requires this statement. I studied his words and deeds well in light of what I myself have seen among the Indians. At times his soul seemed to leave his body while his body became rigid, and he traveled far into regions where he observed the movements of men and heard their thoughts as if they were speaking to him. The difference in language seems to have been no impediment. Besides experiences like this, there are many other things, including the prediction of future events, which I can only explain by the fact that miracles of power and miracles of glory are permitted to occur among pagans as well as among Christians. And I am inclined to think that such miracles are more frequent among pagans. Lacking a miracle of perpetual grace, they have a greater need of other miracles. The power of the deity is not restricted. The name Sitting Bull is frequently associated with the surprise and annihilation of General Custer's troops at the Battle of the Little Bighorn River. According to James McLaughlin, Imi Friend, the Indian Sitting Bull at that time, was in the hills practicing medicine, and his accurate prediction of the battle enabled him to escape the mess with higher honors than he possessed. It is said that Sitting Bull never spoke about the Custer incident with any white man, but among his people he spoke with the utmost freedom, and we have a most impressive account of how this great Indian seer went at night to the battlefield and sought out Custer's body. He performed medicine beside the corpse, and the spirit of the dead general appeared to him, and they conversed together. It was then that Custer announced to Sitting Bull that he would die for the treachery of the whites in 15 years. After Custer's ghost had disappeared, Sitting Bull covered the dead officer's face with a silk handkerchief that Long Hair had previously given to the medicine chief. The details of this story are in Sitting Bull Custer B.A. Makshi Bede. Sitting Bull remembered this warning. He mentioned it to his tribe several times, Its fulfillment was as astonishing as the circumstances of the prophecy. 14 years and 7 months later, Sitting Bull was killed by government agents at Standing Rock. At the time of his murder, Sitting Bull was not on a war footing, he was sleeping peacefully in his cabin. An arrest warrant was issued against him, and the case was then set up in such a way that it was almost certain the chief could not be captured alive. The Indians have claimed that the ghost of Sitting Bull has appeared to them on several occasions. On December 18, 1890, 3 days after his death, the spirit of the great chief appeared to the two Kettle Sioux in the hills by the Bad River. The story was recounted by Tom Hetland 2 days later. He said, "The night before last, some Indians were returning from a small social gathering when a sight was presented before their eyes that chilled them to the bone. One of them turned to the top of a cliff, and there stood a perfectly motionless white figure. Suddenly, one of them cried out in the Sioux language, 'It is Sitting Bull!' The ghost suddenly began to wave an arm in a gesture for them to follow him, and with the speed of a bird, he glided from there to the top of the hill, and then vanished in the direction of the Badlands. It is possible that the great ghost dance at Wounded Knee, which resulted in the terrible massacre, was directly connected to the appearance of Sitting Bull's spirit. To this day it remains a name used by the Sioux to invoke them. The Holy Men of Medicine. Since the establishment of Native American reservations, medicine men have mostly been self-sufficient. They rarely relied on cities as other Native Americans do. Nor do they depend on their powers to earn a living, but rather engage in some occupation common to their tribe, such as farming, raising cattle, or sheep. Native American priests were not celibate, and many medicine men married and had families. In some cases, as in other nations, some holy men have chosen to remain single and dedicate their lives entirely to prayer and meditation. Medicine men rarely interfere openly in the government of their people, but they exert considerable influence in other aspects of tribal life. The Native Americans of the Southwest present interesting challenges for those interested in metaphysical healing. Many of their villages have been inhabited for hundreds of years. Living together in community for many generations shapes the tribe's consciousness, and naturally, problems of social adjustment arise. Simple lessons of intimate life learned over centuries, the very essence of the religions and philosophies of these ancient inhabitants of the region. It has been observed that whenever people live together in close and permanent association, they reach the point of fearing one another more than they fear gods or demons. And so, unsurprisingly, witchcraft is considered by Native American peoples to be one of the primary causes of illness. Although demons and evil spirits are recognized as secondary causes, it is generally accepted that these malevolent entities are set in motion by witches or by witchcraft. For example, illness can be caused by a wizard shooting some foreign substance into the body of a person who has incurred the sorcerer's animosity. The material injected into the victim can be small stones, strands of hair, sticks, or pieces of metal. The injection is performed magically, and the unfortunate victim is unaware of the attack until the affected area begins to hurt. The medicine man searches for the strange substance with the help of a magic eye, a piece of crystal or glass through which he observes as if examining the patient. This inspection experiment has been carried out on white men and women, and in many cases, these experimental patients have admitted that the medicine man, even without being told anything, finds the exact place where the pain was felt. After discovering the location of the wound inflicted by the sorcerer, the next step is to remove the malevolent object. The mystic healer places their mouth on the affected area and sucks out the poisonous object. They show it to the patient, and then it is discarded or destroyed. The patient immediately feels better and is cured. This appears to be a very literal application of Hippocrates' theory that disease is caused by the presence of some foreign substance in the body. Skeptics say that the medicine man, through sleight of hand, put stones or some other material in his mouth before treatment. If this is so, he does it so skillfully that such fraud is rarely discovered. Accidents, in which no magical element is suspected, are treated in the same way. A boy studying at an American Indian school fell one day on a gravel path and painfully injured his knee. Ordinary treatment methods were of little use, and it was feared that the young man might be permanently disabled. After a while, the boy returned to his reservation limping and in great pain, and his parents called for a medicine man. The healer diagnosed the problem. Several pieces of gravel remained in the knee. He then proceeded to suck on them 9 or 10 times, showing the stones to the boy and his parents. The knee immediately improved. The boy soon returned to school completely cured. 30 years ago in Oklahoma, there was a famous Cherokee medicine man named Charlie Hughes. A 10-year-old boy was suffering from a very nasty bladder problem, and the white doctors could do nothing for him. In desperation, his father sent for Hughes. The medicine man told the boy to undress from the waist up, and while the boy was doing so, Hughes went to the fireplace and took a shovelful of coal. He warmed his hands over the embers for a while, and then placed his warm hands on the boy's back in the kidney area. He rubbed the boy's back gently, chanted some ancient healing melody, and then whistled a single note, which he repeated for a while. After a few minutes, he announced that he was finished and left. His patient grew to a healthy adulthood. He told me the story himself, and says that he hasn't had any problems from that day to this day, more than 30 years later. Dr. Eugene Poole, in his aforementioned Medicine and Humanity, he says the following about these extraordinary Indian healers. The leading doctor in my childhood memories, in the neighborhood where my parents settled, was an old Sioux medicine man whose services were considered so valuable by the local government. When his tribe moved to a reservation, he was asked to stay with his white patients, among whom were my parents. I am certain that most of the medicine I received as a child and baby came directly from the tradition of this fine, wise, and highly respected elder. This statement by the president of the New York Academy of Medicine should be important to those who dismiss the medicine man as an ignorant savage, sand painting, curing. Among the Navajo and Hopi tribes, metaphysical healing with colored sand, or dry paint, holds a significant place. These traditional designs are related to divine beings or the tribe's mythical history, and are believed to bring special benefits to the sick for whom they are made. These paintings are destroyed. As soon as the ceremonies are over, the designs are perpetuated only in memory. A few years ago, I had the privilege of hosting the late Hosteen Klah, a distinguished Navajo sand painter and healer, in Los Angeles. He drew 26 designs for me with his own hands on large sheets of cardboard, and through an interpreter he described the symbols and their meanings. He told me that in his healing work, he made the sand paintings large enough for the sick person to sit or lie on as part of the medicine ceremonies. Hosteen Klah, a noble Native American with the face of a sage and the air of a scholar, said quite simply that when the ceremony ended, the patient was well again. Because of the great respect the Navajo have for him, Lorenzo Hubel was allowed to make a motion picture record of a Navajo healing ceremony. The film, made about 15 years ago, has never been publicly shown, but I was fortunate enough to see a special presentation at the Anthropology Laboratory in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Never been publicly shown, but I was fortunate enough to see a special presentation at the Anthropology Laboratory in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Miss Mary C. Wheelwright, an authority on Native American religions, gave a few opening remarks and occasional comments. The image is more revealing, and shows the importance of healing ceremonies to the life of the Navajo people. In the film, the main medicine man is a paraplegic who appears to have suffered from polio as he has lost the use of his lower limbs. Known as the tracker, he was brought from afar to officiate in the rituals. A close look at this holy man's face revealed a fine, sensitive expression and a gaze of profound spiritual understanding. He used very little paraphernalia and relied mostly on the power of his own personality to gain the trust of his patients. Many other famous medicine men attended the tracker at the healing ceremony, which lasted 9 days. Others prepared the large painting of sand, which was the central part of the ritual. Miss Wheelwright remarked that most medicine men are very poor in response to the often made accusation that the rituals were intended for personal gain. No one can view this extraordinary scene without being firmly convinced that all those involved in the ceremony were completely sincere and had no ulterior motives. In a recent book, Singing Navajo Sand Paintings, the author pays the following tribute to the Navajo healer priests. My relationship with numerous medicine men, the light in their faces, the conviction with which they speak of their beliefs, was enough to convince me that their devotion is genuine. One fact that is indisputable is that, when discord or disease takes hold of one of them, no matter how much power he has in his hands, he submits to the care of his fellow singers with complete faith in their ability to heal him. If, as many would have us believe, the medicine priest is merely putting on a show for his own fame or some kind of reward he might hope to gain, he would surely refuse to entrust his life to others of his kind. It is well known that the modern reputable doctor, if he falls ill, is often a bad patient. Is this because he knows his own symptoms too well, or is it because he knows his medical colleagues too well? The medicine man has no such qualms. He takes medicine with complete confidence, for it is the wisdom of his people, bestowed in ancient times by the gods of the tribe. Intellectual birth with flying seeds. Some Dakota tribes have a very curious and interesting belief about the origin of their medicine men. Before their birth into the material world, these priests enter intellectual existence in the form of thistles, like flying seeds. These seeds float in the invisible spirit world on the 4 sacred winds until they finally reach the abode of one of the orders of the gods. Here, the seed spirits are instructed in magic and medicine, as well as in chants, festivals, dances, and sacrificial rituals. This is achieved because the seeds are dreams of the gods. When they have completed their training with one group of deities, the seed spirits fly to another group, and so they continue until they have mastered all celestial knowledge. Finally, perfected in wisdom, these seeds undertake a great journey across the earth, carefully observing the characteristics and customs of all the tribes. In this way, the priest spirit decides where he will be born, and after making this decision, he enters a woman who will be a mother and incarnates in human form. When his earthly labors are finished, the medicine man returns to the abode of the gods he has chosen to serve. There he receives further inspiration and wisdom, and afterward he is reborn as a mortal. 4 is a sacred number for Native Americans, and a medicine priest can be born 4 times in his physical life. After that, he returns to space, according to Gideon H. Pond in the Native Tribes of Schoolcraft of the United States. The description of the human spirit as a flying seed reveals an extraordinary understanding of metaphysical doctrine, and it originates in the clairvoyant observation of disembodied entities. The inclusion of the metempsychosis factor, the soul's passage into another body at death, also indicates that these Indians were aware of the Eastern belief in multiple lives. In an analysis of the medicine man, it is important to remember that women also fulfilled various roles within the medicine cult. Medicine women were held in the same esteem as men and were renowned as spiritual leaders. Women often specialized in childbirth. Like the medicine men, they combined magic and medicinal herbs, the conclusions of the misinformed and the uninformed. Modern intellectuals have great difficulty accustoming their minds to the spiritualist beliefs of ancient peoples. Intensely dominated by the materialistic viewpoint that is currently fashionable, most writers on indigenous religion and healing have assumed that the miracles attributed to shamans are nothing more than clever deceptions. The objections of the ill-informed have been upheld by the uninformed, and strangely, the evidence is considered conclusive. Missionaries have played their part in discrediting pagan miracles and so-called idolatrous tradition. These pious men rarely miss an opportunity to disparage beliefs different from their own. In the past, and to a lesser extent in the present, churches have shaped public opinion, and it could be argued that most Christian religious organizations have condemned the medicine man for every imaginable fault, from mere quackery to infernal necromancy. And recent writer on this subject, he observes, when it is necessary to find an explanation for some difficult problem concerning natural phenomena, it is generally wiser to accept the simplest solution that reasonably covers the elements of the matter. Now, it seems to me that, if this method of reasoning is applied to the known achievements of the Indian medicine man, the simplest solution is to admit that he possesses psychic or mediumistic powers. Civilized man has strayed from the ways of nature into artificial habits of his own invention. He has surrounded himself with a material, economic, and industrial system that is not part of natural law. It is a substitute structure that is always threatening to collapse upon its inventors. The modern intellectual giant, hypnotized by the superstition that he is not superstitious, burdens himself with baseless ideas that any intelligent savage would laugh at. Nature, wise in all its forms, bestows upon its creations the knowledge necessary for their survival. Humankind, in the process of becoming civilized, has repressed its instincts and impulses, and thus lost its psychic connection with universal life. It will commit one folly after another. It is in this way that nature, in the end, mocks human errors. After much suffering, humanity will realize that only by listening to the voice of nature can it survive. This discovery is wisdom, guide through prayer. When the medicine man goes out at night, he builds his fire atop some lonely hill, arranges his prayer sticks in a circle around it, and smokes his medicine pipe in the 6 directions. He is a humble human being seeking to know the path of the great mother of all that lives. He does not boast of his knowledge, nor does he criticize or condemn. He is alone with the stars. Raising his arms to the sky and the mountains, he whispers the simple prayer of a solitary wanderer who does not know where he is, struggling without knowing why. Great Spirit, show us the way. How can anyone dare to say there is no answer to this question? Will the ancient mother, who guides the birds and animals, and teaches them to care for their young and build nests, remain silent in the face of the need of her noblest creatures? Will the world move majestically amidst the harmony of the spheres? And will the old man, reverently waiting by his fire, listen in vain to the voice of his God? Has the skeptic ever waited and fasted for 7 days in the desert while the breeze rustles the feathers on his prayer sticks? Is the contemporary white man always seeking his way in life by waiting humbly, pouring all the love and devotion of his heart into the air alongside the cold grey dawn? If not, then he has no right to say that the prayer of the Indians goes unanswered, because he does not know. It is in these long hours of silent communion that the medicine man hears the voices of the spirits, feels the powers of the air moving through his body, sees the visions that guide his path, and gains the strength to lead his people in accordance with the will of the ancients who sit in the rainbow lodge of heaven and send their voices along the spiritual path of the Milky Way. Here the priest learns the secrets of the soul and its powers, and develops the mystical vision that allows him to see the spirits floating in the ether like flying thistle seeds. In his ecstasies, the old man feels himself slowly leaving his body to ascend, his feet floating, the path of stars that leads to the great medicine hut, where the Manitou sit in council, each smoking his long pipe. We cannot do the things the ancient priests did because we lack the faith of the simple Indian mystics. But do we have any right to deny their powers simply because we live differently, in ways that have led us away from the little path to the hill of vigil? We have our religion, but it is not strong in our hearts, and our priests have not led us anywhere near the path of the ancient gods. Our paths are those of the opposing sect, a clash of creeds, many paths twisting in endless confusion. But the Indian medicine man has preserved that other little path that leads to the high place he has climbed so many times, and on the summit of his prayer hill are the voices and visions, the spiritual guidance of his people. Hippocrates, the father of medicine. From a metaphysical perspective, without the mysteries of Asclepius, there could have been no Hippocrates. He took his vows before the altar of Asclepius and became a priest-physician. His clinical method set a precedent that changed the entire course of medical thought. But materialistic physicians must remember that the father of medicine was a priest until the end of his days, and the wise and careful observations that have earned him humanity's eternal gratitude began in the house of the god of healing. Hippocrates, born 460 after of Christ, considered the father of medicine. Chapter 3, The Cult of Healing of Asclepius Hippocrates. The impeccable physician, the story from prehistoric times, diagnosis and treatment based on dream experiences, the recovery records. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, in the house of the god of healing, the oath, treatments by natural means. Hippocrates' errors, the origin of patient treatment oracles and healing sanctuaries, the intense connection, secular medicine in Rome, the influence of beauty on health, spiritual healing and the rise of beliefs. The impeccable doctor. The Greek healing cult of Asclepius, of great importance to the metaphysical mind, deserves more careful consideration. Although many authors, while modern scholars mention them in connection with the history of medical arts, few devote more than a dozen lines to this extraordinary order of priest-physicians. This lack of interest among scientific writers is undoubtedly due to the miraculous means by which cures were achieved. In the controversy surrounding these cures, whether they were the result of mass delusion or animal magnetism, it does not occur to them that the miracles might be exactly what the Greeks believed them to be, a divine remedy for human ills. And the first priestly healer mentioned in history was the Egyptian physician Imhotep. This powerful man left his people many proverbs and wise observations about illness and health, and after his death he was elevated to the status of a demigod. Temples were built in his honor, and a priesthood serves in these sanctuaries, perpetuating the remedies and magical formulas he gave to the world. Medical schools were established in the houses of Imhotep, and clinics were maintained for the treatment of diseases. Asclepius had accomplished for the Greeks what Imhotep had done for the Egyptians. The sacred mysteries of healing were established in his memory, and his descendants served as priest-physicians until the end of Hellenic civilization. Homer refers to Asclepius as a historical figure, a prince of Thessaly, and calls him the renowned physician. Almost nothing is known about the life of this great healer. He is believed to have married Epione, a daughter of the king of Kos, and to have had 4 children, 2 sons, Macapon and Podalirius, who also became physicians, and 2 daughters, Hygeia and Panacea, whose names are still remembered in the context of healing. Asclepius cannot be dated with certainty, but he probably lived between 1200 and 1000 before Christ. It is possible that some facts are implied in the myths about this demigod of medicine, since mythology has been defined as the history of prehistoric times. In most versions, his father was Apollo, god of healing, and his mother was Coronis, a girl from Thessaly. When Coronis's father forced her to marry a mortal man, Apollo, in his fury, destroyed the family. Coronis, though about to bear a child, was killed by Apollo's sister, the goddess Artemis. Apollo, as his desire for revenge waned, repentant of his actions, and descending in his glory, rescued his son from Coronis's body as she lay on the funeral pyre. Thus, Asclepius was brought into the world by caesarean section, possibly the first account of a child born in this way. It is generally accepted that Apollo entrusted his infant son to Chiron, the centaur, for his education. Chiron, who was also Achilles' mentor, was the one from whom Asclepius learned the mysteries of medicine. Let's rationalize this part of the fable. History in prehistoric times. Centaurs have important symbolic meaning because they represent the children of Timahai's father was Saturn, the ancient father god of time. For the Greek philosophers, therefore, centaurs signify tradition, that which springs from ancient times. Chiron was wise in the ancient, primitive record of humankind. In fact, he was the very personification of tradition, the centaur with his human parts emerging from the body of the animal world. In this sense, the master of fables acquires a new meaning. It is good to remember that all myths readily lend themselves to a reasonable interpretation. After Asclepius had learned all that Chiron could teach him, he began his career as a physician and performed many great and wondrous cures. It is said that on at least one occasion he succeeded in raising a dead man. This was his undoing. Pluto, the lord of death, fearing that Hades might be depopulated by the skill and magic of a mortal, appealed to Zeus to protect the dignity of death and the natural laws of the world. The All-Father then took one of his thunderbolts, forged in the fiery pits of Mount Etna, and hurling it at the physician, destroyed him with the celestial flame. But grateful humanity did not forget its Prometheus of medicine, who had paid with his life for the lives he had restored. Asclepius was elevated to the rank of demigod. Healing sanctuaries were dedicated to him, his sacred mysteries were established, and his descendants continued as priest-physicians forevermore. Many temples to Asclepius were built throughout the Greek city-states, and later also in the Roman Empire. The most famous of these was the Great Hiero, or Sanctuary of Asclepius, at Epidaurus. This magnificent complex of buildings was clustered around the central temple of the healing god, and in the adytum of this sanctuary stood the gold and ivory statue of Asclepius, sculpted by Thrasymedes. The noble-faced divine physician was depicted as a seated figure holding a staff with a snake in one hand. The medicine dog lay at the feet of its deified master. Clustered around the sanctuary were several buildings and rooms for lodging pilgrims and treating the sick. These were large, airy buildings designed to receive abundant sunlight. As evidence that faith alone was not the basis for miracles, most temples of Asclepius were built near medicinal springs, much like modern spas. Diagnosis and treatment through dreams. If the sanctuaries themselves were extraordinary, the healing methods practiced within them were even more so. Diagnosis and treatment were determined through oracles given by the god himself. These oracles were the dreams of the patients. When the sick came to the temple seeking healing, they underwent a special period of preparation. Then, dressed in new white garments, they were carried on their beds to the presence of the statue of Asclepius and spent the night. While they slept, the sick saw the god come to life. He walked among them, spoke to them, and prescribed the necessary remedies. In the morning, the patients recounted their dreams to the priest-physicians, who then prepared the medicines or magical formulas. The modern scientifically trained physician might call this an unpleasant example of primitive superstition. But the sick recovered. They were taken to the sanctuary the next day, and on the third day they walked out to the applause of the crowds. Wasn't it Paracelsus who said that the true aim of medicine is the recovery of the patient? By that definition, these ancients were good physicians. Even Dr. Howard W. Haggard compares them to medicine men. Record of recoveries. The remarkable cures resulting from the oracles of Asclepius were recorded on tablets in the temples for the admiration of visitors and, no doubt, to increase the confidence of the patients. Edgar James Swift quotes several accounts of these metaphysical cures taken from ancient Greek inscriptions of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC before Christ. Dr. Swift's opinion on these cures can be found in his book, The Jungle of the Mind. For those interested in the records themselves and not in the viewpoints on them, here are some summaries. A boy who was mute made his offering at the altar, and the god's torchbearer asked the young man to promise that, if he was cured, he would make the usual offering of thanks. "I promise," the boy replied, and everyone was amazed, for at that moment he had regained his speech. Pandarus the Thessalian begged the god to cure him of scars on his forehead. He dreamed that the god placed a cloth on his head, and when he awoke the cloth was still there. He removed the cloth and noticed that his scars had disappeared. A man blind in one eye who had only an eyelid, no eyeball, was visited in his sleep by a god who appeared to boil a potion and put it in his eyes. The next day he could see with both eyes. This particular story is especially difficult for Dr. Swift. Alcetus, from Alikos, who was blind, dreamed that the god opened his eyes with his fingers, and he saw the trees around the temple. The next day he was completely cured. Hermann of Thassa was cured of his blindness by the god, but he did not make the offering he had promised. His blindness returned, but when he made the promise again, his sight was restored. Further examples of healings by the oracle at the sanctuaries of Asclepius are given later. A European doctor once told me that he didn't like to hear about such miracles because it was unfair. The modern doctor knows much more than the ancient priests, but naturally he cannot compete with the supernatural. Hippocrates, the father of medicine. Among historians of the healing arts, there is a popular belief that Hippocrates of Kos was the Moses of medicine, leading the physicians of his time from the Egyptian darkness of magic and superstition to the promised land of rational therapy. Therefore, it is necessary to examine the life and teachings of this great man from the perspective of a metaphysician. Hippocrates, called the father of medicine, was born on the Greek island of Kos in the year 460 before Christ. His father was from the Asclepiad family. The guild of healers descended from the deified Asclepius. Early writers acknowledge that Hippocrates was the seventh in direct lineage from the divine physician. Hippocrates' mother, Phainarete, traced her ancestry back to Hercules, the strongest of mortals. From such an illustrious lineage, one might expect a genius to emerge. Hippocrates studied medicine with his father, Heraclides, a renowned healer. Later, in Athens, he apprenticed with the physician Herodicus. He was a student for a time of Gorgias of Leontini, a brilliant sophist, and also received instruction from Democritus of Abdera, a man of vast knowledge and one of the fathers of atomic theory. Clearly, Hippocrates was well versed in the mental disciplines that are the necessary foundation of intellectual greatness. After completing his education, in accordance with the custom of his time, Hippocrates returned to Kos, took his vows before the altar of Asclepius, and became a priest-physician like his father before him. We do not know how long he spent in the temple of the god of healing. In various places and for most of his life, he attended to the needs of the sick, and we have preserved his careful considerations on diseases through his numerous writings. There is no doubt that Hippocrates was the greatest of Asclepius's successors, and the materialist physician must remember that the father of medicine was a priest until the end of his days. How is it that Hippocrates has received praise from historians of medicine, but the great order of priest-physicians who produced him has been overlooked, receiving scarcely a grudging compliment? If it had not been for the mysteries of Asclepius, there would have been no Hippocrates. If greatness is to be honored, is not the cause of that greatness equally worthy of respect? It is unreasonable to accept a man's achievements and then deny or ignore the things that made that man who he was. The materialist's problem is, how can he afford to honor his hero's teachers, since doing so would force him to acknowledge his debt to the mystical and metaphysical arts? A grateful world has showered honors upon the memory of Hippocrates. His knowledge, for his time, was extraordinary, and his personal character was beyond reproach. His clinical methods established a precedent that changed the entire course of medical thought. All this is readily admitted, but this is not the end of the matter, for there are reasons for resentment regarding the statements that appear in almost every modern text on the early history of medicine. Its general importance is as follows. Hippocrates was the first to separate medicine from superstition and the priesthood. He based his practice on the principles of inductive philosophy and directed special attention to the natural history of disease. In the house of the god of healing, it should not be forgotten that Hippocrates was born in the shadow of the sanctuary of Asclepius, that his father was a priest-physician, and that the young Hippocrates first encountered disease in the healthy and hygienic environment of Hieron. Those wise and careful observations that have earned him the eternal gratitude of humanity had their beginnings in the house of the healing god. Here, patients were accommodated in wards, and the attendants always ensured their comfort. Hippocrates could sit beside their couches, listen to their symptoms, and observe the course of their illnesses. He had the opportunity to observe and study thousands of cases and distinguish many types of diseases. Only the great clinics of Asclepius could have provided such an opportunity for research. However, it wasn't possible to monitor patients in the temples, as they only stayed for a short time. Therefore, Hippocrates likely also established his own clinics to observe the progression of certain diseases. The limited information available about Hippocrates' private practice suggests that his clinics were modeled, with some modifications, on the temples. Some modern thinkers have led us to imagine that Hippocrates stood alone in a world of ignoramuses, like a bright light in universal darkness. This is difficult to believe. Socrates, Plato, Democritus, Demosthenes, Aristippus, and even Aristotle were among his contemporaries. He lived during the golden age of Greek intellectual culture, one of the highest points in the philosophical life of humankind. Plato and Socrates definitely believed in the mysteries, accepted the mystical tradition, and acknowledged the existence of the gods and heroic souls, and these have been reasons why materialist opinion has sought to diminish their glory. The celebrated oath. It would be interesting to know what Hippocrates himself believed about the gods and the afterlife. He was an initiate of the Asclepian cult, and the famous oath attributed to him begins with these words, "I swear by Apollo the physician, by Asclepius, by Hygeia and Panacea, by all the gods and goddesses calling them to witness," etc. Therefore, one might suspect that Hippocrates was not a perfect example of unfettered materialism. It might also be remembered that very little good has come to humankind, in any age, from those of little faith. Regarding the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath, the great oath of medical ethics, has been the subject of some debate among inquisitive minds as to whether Hippocrates was its true author. Like the Lord's Prayer in the Jewish Talmud, it is quite possible that the Hippocratic Oath was part of the Asclepian rites, long before Hippocrates came into being. This oath, especially the opening lines, is not entirely satisfactory to non-mystics. Not long ago, I had the privilege of participating in a discussion where this very thought troubled several eminent physicians. The final, mature opinion of these gentlemen was that the oath should be revised. They wanted the references to the gods removed entirely, as they were inconsistent with the state of modern enlightenment. It is difficult to believe that the priest-physician who took his oath, when oaths meant something by all the gods and goddesses, is the same man who, according to many texts, separated medicine from the priesthood. We know that Hippocrates, through a series of clinical observations, made numerous important discoveries concerning the nature and course of diseases and the effects of various remedies which were generally unknown before his time. But this does not prove that he had any intention of overthrowing priestly medicine, nor does it indicate any intention of denying spiritual factors in the problem of health. It is true that Hippocrates said that there is no authority except facts, but the Greeks would certainly have been the first to assert that it would be a poor religion if facts fell from the sky. The Jesuit priest, Athanasius Kircher, discoverer of several important facts for medicine, remained a devout man. He never expressed any fear that his findings would overthrow the papacy. The secular physician likely emerged as a result of Hippocrates' emphasis on the causes and treatment of physical disease, but in many ways this separation was a loss, not a gain, for medicine. The division was not necessary for scientific progress. A religious system that produced such prominent figures as Pythagoras and Plato would not have hindered Hippocrates' medical practices. There is no evidence that any effort was made to interfere with any of his methods. Hippocrates practiced his medical convictions and communicated them to his disciples without hindrance or persecution, as did most other teachers of his time, provided they did not become involved in politics. Treatments by natural means. Hippocrates demonstrated, probably without fully realizing the implications, that many diseases can be successfully treated by natural means alone. This viewpoint had numerous advantages, but it also had many significant disadvantages, as was the time for demonstrating them. The greatest good that came with the so-called Hippocratic reform was the impetus it gave to medical research into the physical realm. It provided a reason for physicians to relentlessly seek natural remedies for human ills. The greatest evil that resulted from the new viewpoint was the gradual but relentless drift of medicine away from the ethical and spiritual standards that the mysteries imposed on physicians. What were the medical opinions of Hippocrates of Chios? He divided the causes of disease into two general classes. The first related to climate, environment, and location, and the second, internal or personal, such as habits, diet, and exercise. He believed that appearance, disposition, and mentality were greatly influenced by the environment, which explained the general superiority of the Greeks. He did not live to see or explain the decline of the Greeks despite his admirable position. According to Hippocratic doctrine, illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humours, or bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When these four humours are not in the proper proportion, illness invariably occurs, and if they can be brought into a more favourable balance, a cure can be achieved. The father of medicine was more famous for prognosis than diagnosis, and was accused of having a fatalistic approach to treatment. Perhaps he brought this fatalism with him from the Asclepian temples, since the rules of these sanctuaries included one stating that obviously hopeless cases could not be treated. With Hippocrates, if previous cases of a similar nature had ended fatally, he was unlikely to oppose the course of the disease. The Hippocratic theory of treatment has been called cautious and expectant. Diet and baths were his favourite remedies, and he made considerable use of herbs. Leclerc compiled a list of nearly 400 milks, wines, fruits, vegetables, fats, and other simple remedies that he prescribed. Ox and deer horns, and the dung of goats, mules, donkeys, geese, and foxes are included in his pharmacology. Hippocrates' views on the subject of astrology are particularly offensive to modern practitioners. His treatments were not what brought him the most fame, although the Athenians honored him for his services during the plague outbreak. Hippocrates was primarily an observer of diseases, and his two sons, also Asclepian physicians, helped him compile the various case histories that became the basis of his writings. He was sometimes accused of being more interested in observing his patients than trying to help them, and his contemporaries accused him of letting the sick die by doing nothing to keep them alive. In this practice, he differs markedly from the modern physician, who prolongs life by any means available, assuming that hope lasts until the patient dies. It was probably his prognostic ability that led Hippocrates to neglect cases he considered hopeless. 87 books are attributed to him, but most of these were probably written by other learned physicians of his time, some with the same name as him. This would indicate that he was part of a group of like-minded men. On this subject, in The Doctor in History, Howard W. Haggard, professor of applied physiology at Yale, writes, "Hippocrates exists as a name rather than a man. Under that name we group together all the great and now forgotten men of Greece, who in the 5th before Christ they formed the scientific basis of medicine. The writings of Hippocrates, the main works believed to be the author of Hippocrates of Kos, deal with topics such as forecasts, epidemics, diet and air, water and the environment. Some of his best writings are his aphorisms, short, forceful, objective, and descriptive sentences. The most famous and sobering of these aphorisms is, 'Life is short and art is long.' Another typical one is, 'If a patient with a fear of water suffers from hiccups, the case is hopeless.' Hippocrates was known to the Arabs as Bokrat, and his writings were treasured among them during the long night of Europe's dark ages. A great mythology has grown up around this great physician, and miracles have been attributed to him that seem no less remarkable than those performed by the divine Asclepius. Since many of these myths are of Greek origin, and some are very ancient, it does not appear that Hippocrates was considered a materialist by his contemporaries or followers. If old opinions are confusing, modern ones aren't any better. Logan Clendening, in his book, Behind the Doctor in his 1933 work, he writes, "It is doubtful that a single person known as Hippocrates ever existed. It would be quite embarrassing if the father of objective medicine were a myth. One thing is certain, however, most medical historians do not believe the great physician was a figment of the imagination. For them, he was a very real person, with a long grey beard and an academic, though not Greek appearance. How little we truly know about these matters about which we are so certain. My opinion is that few myths are not based on reality, and Hippocrates was certainly a real person, but many of his achievements originated among the thinkers of his time, or even earlier. The origin of patient treatment. Another important contribution Hippocrates made to modern medicine was his approach to patient care. The physician would enter the room with dignity, and if the illness was not in an aggressive stage, he would sit beside the patient and question them in a gentle manner about their age, lifestyle, recent exposure to infections or contagions, diet, and recent illnesses, paying particular attention to their present discomforts and symptoms. This was followed by a general examination. He also had to address the delicate matter of previous physicians and their prescriptions, as it was unethical to question a colleague's competence. He would then prescribe new medications and recommendations. This Hippocratic procedure has changed little since his time. As for Hippocrates' later life, nothing is known except that he died in Larissa. Ancient writers varied on the length of his life, giving estimates of 85, 90, 104, and 109 years. Clinton gives 104 years, but most modern scholars are more conservative, finding larger figures unrealistic. He had at least 2 sons, Thessalus and Dracon, but the date of his marriage and his wife's name are unknown. We know little of the wise physician whose name bears the responsibility of forever separating the art of healing from its priestly founders. The more we study his mind and methods, the more we feel the injustice done to him in the name of glory. What Hippocrates truly believed was that the gods help those who help themselves. He taught that men should not depend on divine aid for all the ailments of the flesh, but should seek natural means to heal the wounds of their own negligence. This is not only sound science, it is also sound religion. The numerous Catholic and Protestant hospitals in our communities, equipped with all modern instruments for diagnosis and treatment, demonstrate that religions do not reject the progress of scientific knowledge. The great division exists only in the mind, and attitudes, not facts, are responsible for the long-standing antagonism between gods and doctors, to the dishonor of both. In his treatise on the sacred disease regarding epilepsy, Hippocrates reveals his true position in his own words. Such things, he writes, whether divine or not, the distinction is of no consequence to me, and there is no need to make such a division in nature, for all things are either divine or all things are human. Here, the physician, in his own words, denies the division that has been made in his name. Division leads not to progress, but to confusion. The fruits of division are dissension, intolerance, and waste. Where many schools teach the same subject differently, all knowledge is obscured. Humanity is united in all that is essential and divided only in matters of secondary importance. But it has been fashionable to magnify difference and ignore the great things that unite the world. Selfishness and stupidity caused the Dark Ages, the Inquisition, the wars and economic upheavals that have plagued humanity for centuries, and, last but not least, the discord of religion, divided into hundreds of sects that serve God by undermining one another. Oracles and healing sanctuaries. The discoveries made by Hippocrates did not destroy the cult of Asclepius. It remained for centuries the principal guardian of public health. A great plague broke out in Rome and threatened to destroy the entire city. The Romans sent an ambassador to Epidaurus to plead for the help of the god of healing. The oracles were consulted, and Asclepius was pleased to hear the Romans' plea. He allowed them to bring him to Rome in the form of a living serpent. As the ship sailed down the Tiber on the return journey, the god slipped off the side of the ship and became an island in the river. The Romans, taking this as an omen, built a sanctuary to Asclepius on this island, and thanks to the god's favor, the plague was overcome. A commemorative tablet was found at the site of this temple on Tiber Island. The tablet commemorates 4 miraculous healings that took place at this sanctuary. The essence of the 4 inscriptions is as follows. Gaius, who was blind, consulted the oracle and was told to approach the altar, offer prayers, cross the temple from right to left, place 5 fingers on the altar, raise his other hand, and place it over his eyes. He regained his sight in the presence of many people. This occurred during the reign of Antoninus, around 120 Anno Domini. Valerius Aper, a blind soldier, consulted the oracle and was told to mix the blood of a white rooster with honey and rub this ointment on his eyes for 3 days. He regained his sight and thanked the god. A man named Julian, who had a pulmonary hemorrhage, consulted the oracle and was told to go to the altar, then take some pine nuts, mix them with honey and eat them for 3 days. He was cured. Lucius's son was dying of pleurisy. Asclepius appeared to him in a dream and told him to take ashes from the altar, mix them with wine, and rub them on his side. He was saved and gave thanks to the god. If these inscriptions are representative of Asclepiad therapy, it is not difficult to understand why the Greeks and Romans so admired the cult of priest-physicians. Since the rise of the psychological perspective, it became customary to dismiss all accounts of miraculous healings as purely psychic or as the result of mental suggestion. This attitude is justified by the assumption that only functional illnesses could be treated in this way, and that only the secular physician is qualified to deal with serious organic disorders. Let us apply this kind of logic to the testimonies on the tablet of Asclepius from Tiber Island. Blindness, pulmonary hemorrhage, and pleurisy are not superficial illnesses by medical standards. It may be true that blindness can be caused by hysteria, but, again, it is more often a manifestation of very serious physical ailments. It is difficult to believe that pulmonary hemorrhage is merely a mild form of mental disturbance, and its instantaneous cure is something physicians should consider. The same applies to pleurisy. If psychic medicine can produce results like those described on the memorial tablet, it is a valuable and important part of healing techniques. Perhaps, in fact, it is the therapy of the future, in answer to the prayers of a suffering humanity that has been drugged and purged and bled for the past 2,000 years in the name of materia medica. Not long ago, a man chose my sympathetic ear to pour out the long history of his physical ailments. His record includes 20 years of suffering, a dozen ineffective doctors, and complete financial ruin. Would it be interesting to note that this poor, long-suffering mortal would gladly exchange the opinions of his 12 physicians for a slightly inspired alternative regarding his condition? The connection eyes cut. Even the trained psychologist knows pathetically little about the powers of the human mind. He is searching, but only centuries of constant effort will suffice to perfect his knowledge. Is it possible that the initiated priest-physicians of antiquity had a spiritual insight into the origin and treatment of diseases, and that the secular physician lost it when he severed his connection with the great mystical institutions of healing? The modern materialist assumes a negative answer to this question, but an assumption is not a fact. When Plato opened his school at the Lyceum, he discovered a nearby swamp that made the location unhealthy. Shortly afterward, he was struck by a dangerous fever caused by the foul air. His disciples advised him to move the academy to a healthier location, but the teacher refused, explaining that a wise man could free himself from the influence of any environment once he recognized the nature of the difficulty. Plato cured himself of the fever through sheer willpower and continued at the Lyceum for the rest of his life without the illness recurring. He lived to old age and finally passed away at the age of 81. It is reported that his death was not due to any illness but to the general infirmities of old age. He died in his sleep with the books of the poet Sophron under his pillow. A swamp is not a fixation, a phobia, a neurosis, or an inhibition. It is a very real source of illness. A mental attitude alone is not enough to overcome its malignant power, nor is autosuggestion a reasonable response. Plato could have denied that the swamp could harm him, but in the end, his constitution would have been undermined. There is much more to metaphysical healing than simple affirmation and denial. It seems certain that Plato was able to make himself immune to local fevers. Who can deny that such knowledge would be valuable, even in this age of inoculation? Plato taught by his example that man possesses within himself the power to cure the diseases of his body, that in the end, each man is his own priest and each man is his own doctor. Wisdom is a universal medicine, and it is the only remedy for ignorance, the great disease of humanity. This is the doctrine of the mystics, the doctrine they learned in the ancient temples, the doctrine that must one day be the foundation of all enlightened therapy. Secular medicine in Rome. The approximate dates of the cures, the dates recorded on the commemorative tablet, are fixed by the first inscription in the reign of Antoninus or at the beginning of the 2nd century. By that time, secular medicine was well established in Rome, and there were numerous Greek physicians who were not priests. Thus, we can assume they were a product of the great separation attributed to Hippocrates. These physicians first arrived in the Roman Empire about 2 centuries before the Christian era, and because of Roman respect for Greek culture, they established valuable and profitable practices. By studying these men, we can uncover some of the results of the secularization of medicine. These physicians, who had long since abandoned spiritual values in their pursuit of physical knowledge, were, on the whole, a breeding ground for disease. Cato the Elder spoke out against them, declaring that the Romans had flourished for 6 centuries without physicians, only to be murdered in the end by Greek doctors. For these inquisitive physicians, humankind had lost its identity as children of God and had become mere anamnesis, driven by their thirst for knowledge and their ethics. Pliny writes, "It is at our expense that they learn and experiment by killing us. A physician is the only person who can kill another with absolute impunity. Moreover, all the blame falls solely on the sick person. They are immediately accused of disobedience, and it is the dead and missing person who is put on trial." It was at this point, too, that commercialism showed its dark side. Priest-physicians were tied to temples that were supported by the state. If grateful patients who had benefited from their care wished to make gifts to the temple, that was fine and good. Most sanctuaries were filled with treasures, along with smaller gifts of no physical value given by the poor, but each offering was a sign that the help was genuine. Secular Greek physicians, however, charged exorbitant prices. They based their fees on the financial means of the patient and charged the same whether the patient lived or died. Where medicine ceased to be a religion, it became a business. When Cato said that the Romans had gone 600 years without physicians, he meant that, until the appearance of the Greek physicians, the healing arts had been maintained by the priestly class. Priest-physicians and healing temples were the sole custodians of public health during the rise of the Roman Empire, and secular physicians held authority during the empire's decline. Until the arrival of Greek physicians, Romans had never paid a fee for medical care, but the astute Greeks assured their new patients that a man only appreciates what he pays for. The new therapies eliminated the superstition of divine intervention and replaced it with the superstition that money could buy health and pay for extravagance. The greatest harm was that high prices kept healthcare out of reach of the poor, and it was the poor who had to fight and die for the glory of Rome. The Romans spent considerable time adapting to the new scientific view of medicine. They enacted laws against malpractice, regulated fees, and devised legal methods to hold physicians accountable for their errors and their consequences. Of course, the new physicians were supposed to be people of high ethical principles, and they had taken the Hippocratic Oath. But how important is an oath to the gods when belief in and faith in those gods were waning? These men were no longer guided by their own spiritual convictions, by a belief in the reality of divine powers, and so, as always, it became necessary to govern their actions through man-made codes to protect society from overexploitation. It has always been difficult to make laws against a privileged class, especially if that class organizes itself against any regulation that interferes with its complete freedom of action. The Romans discovered this when they tried to regulate the practice of medicine. They were partially successful, but the Eternal City never again enjoyed the medical freedom it had before the arrival of the Greek physicians. For several centuries, priestly healing and materia medica coexisted in a state of armed truce. For priests, the secular physician was guilty of the most serious form of sacrilege, and for emancipated physicians, priests were a superstitious group regarding their claims of healing. In the midst of this situation, as tensions escalated, another complication arose. The Christian religion began its rise to power. There is nothing mysterious about the collapse of pagan Rome. The emperors were degenerate, the aristocracy decadent, the laws corrupted by private interest, their religions had been profaned, their citizens demoralized by constant warfare, their treasuries depleted by public corruption, and their provinces invaded by barbarians. In the face of all this tribulation, a recent writer with the modern medical attitude toward history naively suggests that malaria was a dominant factor in what Edward Gibbons describes as the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Could it be that the city built by Romulus on the banks of the Tiber River, which ruled the known world for centuries, by a curious coincidence, succumbed to malaria at the precise moment when its ethics and morality reached their lowest point? This attitude is typical of people who try to think about the problems of their world with their minds turned away from the benefits of spiritual education. The influence of beauty on health. When secular medicine separated from the mysteries of Asclepius, it left in such a hurry that it left behind many of the most important furnishings and accessories of the healing art. Primarily, it abandoned the high ethical standards that should apply to all relationships between public servants and the public they serve. In the temples, it was taught that wisdom was a divinely bestowed superiority, and that men so favored by the gods should always conduct themselves in a manner worthy of the faith that inspires their wisdom. In their hasty departure, the new doctors also overlooked the role that beauty plays in the health of humanity. Profit became their sole obsessive concern, and even today, after centuries of progress, the modern hospital resembles a factory more than a temple of the health. The temples of Asclepius were places of beauty and gentle dignity. There may have been less efficiency, but there was certainly a noble and beautiful spirit in these sacred places. The priest-physicians were servants of a loving God who looked with infinite compassion upon his suffering world. The human body was the living temple of a living spirit, and it was cared for with gentleness and reverence. Why is it not possible for a world, rich and powerful beyond the dreams of the Greeks, to restore this benevolent form of health, adding all that scientific knowledge can offer? Certainly then, healing can be practiced with the same wise beauty that the ancients knew. Doctors, in their rush for freedom, also left behind the more enlightened, ancient concepts about the ethics of healing, the simple acceptance that medicine is for all sick people. At the temple of Asclepius in Rome, slaves abandoned by their masters to die were brought in and hospitalized until they recovered. One of the emperors passed a law stipulating that such slaves, if they recovered, would be freed, and their former masters would have no rights over them. Naturally, most of these slaves could not afford treatment, but this made no difference. The gift of health was considered a divine right of humankind. This famous temple on the island of Tiber, the first hospital, served rich and poor alike without discrimination. The modern world has hospitals in cities and towns and free clinics, the latter usually associated with some medical school, but few of these compare favorably, at least in spirit, with the sanctuaries of the healing God. The vast majority of these charitable institutions are an embarrassment to modern civilization, and those who enter through their ornate doors must humble themselves and even, in some cases, become impoverished to obtain the necessary medical care. And once settled in, they are at the mercy of inexperienced interns and overworked nurses, and they are reminded in many ways that they are enjoying the grudging generosity of the public. Instead of being inspired by the feeling that a loving world is genuinely interested in their recovery, these patients know that the primary concern of everyone involved is to get them out of the place in the least amount of time and with the least possible inconvenience, so that someone else can use the stretcher. These misfortunes are, without a doubt, byproducts of the famous division between religion and medicine for which the wise Hippocrates is blamed. However great and important the contribution of science may be, It alone cannot perfect civilization. If man were merely an animal, living an animal existence and suffering only from the vicissitudes of the animal world, a physical perspective might suffice to preserve his economy. But man is more than this. He is a creature elevated by his mental and emotional energies to a unique position among created things. The wisest men of all time have believed in the reality of spiritual values and have been inspired to serve human needs, not by the desire for profit, but by love for humanity. There must be religion if the human race is to endure, and nowhere is religion more essential than among those with degrees and who are specialists. There must be something of the priest in every doctor, and something of the doctor in every priest. Each needs the other, and they do not need the division between them, which is the modern boast. Two schools of medicine have come down to us through the centuries, honored and respected by humanity. The first and oldest is spiritual medicine, with its doctrines of faith, prayer, penance, divine intercession, miracles, and, if desired, pure and selfless magic. The second, and much younger, school is material medicine, which develops new forms of chemistry, biochemistry, and electricity. Between these two now lies psychology, ancient in its origins but new in technique. It must strive to unite the mystic and the physician for the survival of the human race. There seems to be no good reason for so many scientists to eternally endeavor to destroy mysticism and to condemn and ridicule the ancient paths that made people happier and better. There is even less reason to attempt, year after year, in books and articles, to destroy people's faith in spirit and prayer. For most of humanity, these are the most important things in all of life. The doctor's task is to help us through painful days and suffering nights, and anyone who doesn't appreciate it is a fool. But the doctor walks with us, only a little further. With or without science, every person must ultimately pass through the same dark door into the unknown. Even the doctor himself is mortal, and when his years are in their prime, his end is the same as that of an old dreamer who has departed long before. Science belongs only to this world. Humankind, the mystery of mysteries, does not. Can science solve the mystery of that other world where time rests with the ages? Perhaps, someday, but not yet. Edison was working on a type of telephone that could connect the living and the dead, but death came to him before he finished the work. Someday someone else will continue it, and science will unite the two worlds. But until that day, humankind can only hold on to faith to keep strong. Spiritual healing and the growth of beliefs. The great mystery schools of antiquity, the sources of most of what we know and believe, taught that human consciousness was limited only by the intellectual boundaries it imposed upon itself. Is this impossible? Has the modern materialist thinker truly attempted to explore the depths of their own being? Have you sincerely examined all the evidence that is available, against of your own opinion? Have you refuted miracles, magic, clairvoyance, spiritualism, and telepathy? Spiritual healing is good and necessary for those who believe in it and have made it part of their religion. And there is much in mysticism that would be good for everyone. Superstitions and false doctrines will pass. All of humanity has beliefs that in 100 years will be considered superstitions, and scientists and doctors are not immune. There is much good in it, and if we are doing less of the best we know, it is because we are hampered by a medieval education system and Victorian immorality. As time goes on, medicine will rely less and less on strong drugs to achieve its results. The movement is already underway. Gradually, the mind and its power will replace many revered remedies. Then we will discover that there is something even deeper than the mind, and so we will continue our cautious advance into the world of the spirit. When we finally arrive there, wouldn't it be strange if we returned to the ancient paths of the gods and discovered that the temples of the early days held truths that will only become common knowledge in the latter days? Let us honor Hippocrates of Kos, who taught men how to find natural ways to achieve health. But let us honor him, not as the father of a terrible division, but as the Greek sage who said, "There is no need to make such a division in nature, for all things are either divine or all things are human." Theophrastus. Paracelsus. An old portrait commemorating the death by poison of Paracelsus of Hohenheim, the greatest metaphysical physician in European history. It is believed that the great physician was murdered by a professional assassin hired by jealous and vengeful doctors.